May 14th, 2026. Three things happened in the last 24 hours that, placed together in the same analytical frame, tell you more about where this conflict is heading than any diplomatic communique or peace proposal. The first thing is a massive explosion in Shiraz, in Iran's Fars province, that Iranian state media is calling a gas leak. The second thing is a New York Times assessment revealing that Iran has retained 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile. The New York Times also reports that Iran has regained access to 90% of its underground missile storage and launch facilities during the ceasefire window. The third thing is multiple B-1B Lancer bombers running training missions from bases in England, tracking down through Europe toward the Middle East, while President Trump sits in Beijing meeting with Xi Jinping. Put those three things in the same frame, and what you get is not a ceasefire in any meaningful operational sense. What you get is two sides simultaneously rebuilding, repositioning, and training for the next phase. An explosion in a city that is home to Iran's underground missile facilities is almost certainly not a gas leak. The gas leak explanation is the explanation Iran always uses when something blows up near a facility it does not want to acknowledge exists. It is the same explanation that followed the explosion at the Kojir missile complex in 2022, the blast at the Parchin military facility in 2023, and the detonation at the Isfahan missile assembly plant in 2024. Every time something explodes near Iranian weapons infrastructure, the atmosphere suddenly develops a combustible gas problem. And every time, independent analysis identifies the explosion's proximity to weapons facilities as the more probable explanation. The New York Times assessment that Iran has been digging out its underground missile storage tells you what was likely happening in Shiraz when the explosion occurred. Iran was digging out its missiles, and one of them detonated. To understand why this combination of signals is the most compressed collection of escalation indicators this conflict has produced, you need to see where both sides are positioned as the ceasefire continues its progression from life support toward whatever comes after. Here is where things stand as of May 14th, 2026. CENTCOM has confirmed that a total of 67 ships have been intercepted and turned around by the American naval blockade since April 13th. 4 vessels have been shot up after refusing to comply with blockade enforcement orders, producing the footage that CENTCOM released publicly showing night vision boarding operations, door gunners locked and loaded. Iran is losing $500 million per day. The ceasefire is on life support, in the president's own words. The Pentagon is actively discussing Operation Sledgehammer as the replacement framework for resumed major combat operations. A massive explosion occurred in Shiraz on May 13th, in a city home to significant Iranian underground missile infrastructure. The New York Times has published an assessment based on intelligence from multiple collection streams, including satellite imagery and other surveillance technology, stating that Iran retains 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile, has maintained 70% of its mobile launchers, and has regained access to 90% of its underground missile storage and launch facilities. Chinese cargo vessels and oil tankers are transiting the Strait of Hormuz blockade while President Trump is in Beijing, creating the diplomatic sensitivity that makes intercepting those specific vessels at this specific moment politically complicated. That is the operational picture as of today. The Shiraz explosion is the data point that deserves the most immediate analytical attention, because it sits at the intersection of the missile retention assessment and the underground facility access recovery data in a way that the gas leak explanation cannot accommodate. Shiraz is the capital of Fars province. It is home to significant concentrations of Iranian weapons infrastructure, including underground missile storage facilities that survived Operation Epic Fury's strike packages because they were either sufficiently deep, sufficiently dispersed, or sufficiently camouflaged. The New York Times assessment stated that Iran has regained access to roughly 90% of its underground missile storage and launch facilities nationwide, which are now assessed to be partially or fully operational. Military intelligence agencies reach this conclusion based on multiple collection streams. Now a massive explosion has occurred in Shiraz on May 13th, in a city where underground missile facilities are known to be concentrated. The IRGC has been digging out its missiles throughout the ceasefire window, working to reconstitute its ballistic missile inventory. When you dig out ordnance that has been through the trauma of being in proximity to strikes, that has been subject to structural stresses, and that you are moving under time pressure because the ceasefire window is finite, the probability of an uncontrolled detonation during handling is not zero. The gas leak explanation for a massive explosion in Shiraz is the explanation you use when the real explanation identifies the facility type, the operational activity, and the intelligence value of the location more clearly than the regime is comfortable acknowledging. Now let us get into the missile retention assessment, because the New York Times numbers require careful analytical reading rather than the surface interpretation that either alarmism or dismissal would produce. 70% of Iran's pre-war mobile launchers retained, 70% of the pre-war missile stockpile retained, 90% of underground storage and launch facilities with recovered access. On one reading, these numbers suggest that Operation Epic Fury's results were considerably more limited than the public accounts of the campaign suggested. On the correct reading, these numbers tell you something more specific and more nuanced. Iran's missile inventory before Operation Epic Fury was enormous, accumulated across decades of production at facilities specifically hardened against conventional strikes. The campaign was not designed to destroy 100% of that inventory across every facility in the country in a single strike package. It was designed to destroy the most operationally significant components of the inventory. The systems with the greatest immediate threat to American naval assets and Gulf partner infrastructure, while degrading the command and launch infrastructure that would coordinate a mass missile attack. 70% of a very large stockpile remaining after the strikes does not mean the strikes failed. It means the strikes achieved specific operational objectives rather than total inventory elimination. What the 90% underground facility access recovery number tells you is that Iran has been using the ceasefire window to reconstitute the launch infrastructure more aggressively than the tactical implications of the ongoing ceasefire would suggest is consistent with negotiating in good faith. Read that carefully. 90% recovery of underground launch facility access during a ceasefire is not ceasefire behavior. It is preparation for the next phase of fighting conducted under ceasefire cover, which is precisely the time-buying strategy that the IRGC's institutional logic has been executing since April 7th. The IRGC does not view ceasefires as pauses in conflict. It views them as operational windows, periods during which the enemy's targeting cycle is paused, but your own reconstitution cycle is not. Periods during which the diplomatic track provides cover for the military track. Periods during which the facilities that were destroyed in the first phase can be rebuilt, restocked, and reconnected to the command network before the second phase begins. The 90% recovery number is the quantitative expression of that strategy, and the Shiraz explosion is the qualitative evidence that the strategy is being executed under conditions of operational risk that the IRGC's institutional urgency is forcing it to accept. Now let us talk about China. Because the weapon supply story is the dimension of this conflict that the Trump-Beijing summit was designed to address directly, and that the Chinese cargo vessels transiting the Hormuz blockade during the summit's 36-hour window have just made into the most diplomatically sensitive operational question in the current theatre. China has been actively supplying Iran with weapons components throughout the ceasefire period, not discussing potential arms sales. Actively supplying. Ships have been identified. One has been stopped. 8 mysterious, all-white, large aircraft with no visible markings were observed entering Iranian airspace during the ceasefire period, carrying payloads that intelligence agencies assessed as consistent with weapons or weapons components originating from either Russian or Chinese territory. Chinese companies have been engaging in discussions about arms sales that the New York Times characterized as potential, while the operational picture tells a different story. The ballistic missile component supply that has been documented through intercepted shipments is specifically the category of material that would accelerate the reconstitution of the missile inventory that the New York Times assessment describes. You do not regain access to 90% of your underground missile storage facilities during a ceasefire if those facilities' operational status depends on components you cannot source because the blockade has sealed your maritime import routes. Unless someone is providing those components through a channel the blockade cannot seal, China is providing those components. The channel that the blockade cannot seal is the combination of the Pakistani land corridor and the Chinese vessels that are transiting the Hormuz blockade during the precise 36-hour window when President Trump is in Beijing. And the diplomatic sensitivity of boarding a Chinese vessel while the American president is sitting across from Xi Jinping makes enforcement complicated. Read that timing carefully. Chinese cargo vessels transiting the Hormuz blockade zone during the Trump-Beijing summit is not a coincidence of operational scheduling. It is a calculation. Beijing understands that the diplomatic context of the summit creates a specific window during which American naval enforcement of the blockade against Chinese-flagged vessels would generate the kind of immediate diplomatic incident that would dominate the summit's agenda in ways neither side's agenda setters intended. The Chinese vessel transits during the summit are testing whether the blockade's enforcement rules have a Beijing exception that the diplomatic context of the summit makes temporarily operational. If American naval forces intercept and board Chinese vessels while Trump is meeting Xi, the summit becomes a confrontation about the interception rather than a negotiation about the larger Iran framework. If American forces do not intercept the Chinese vessels because of the summit's diplomatic context, Beijing has identified a window during which its weapons supply operation has reduced enforcement risk. The correct analytical read of the Chinese vessel transits during the summit is that they are an intelligence operation as much as a logistics operation. Testing American enforcement behavior under conditions of diplomatic sensitivity to establish what the exception parameters are and whether they can be exploited at future summit intervals. This is how Beijing operates. It does not challenge American enforcement directly. It probes the boundaries of enforcement at moments when the political cost of enforcement is highest. It establishes through operational testing what the actual rules are, as distinct from what the stated rules are, and it uses the intelligence gained from those tests to calibrate its next moves. The vessels transiting during the summit are not just delivering weapons components. They are delivering information about American enforcement thresholds that is as valuable to Beijing as the physical payloads are to Tehran. Now let us talk about what Saudi Arabia has done that was not widely reported until yesterday, because this development adds a dimension to the regional coalition picture that fundamentally changes the assessment of how many actors are actively fighting Iran and from how many directions. Reuters, citing people familiar with the matter, has confirmed that Saudi Arabia conducted strikes during the conflict against Iranian-backed militias in southern Iraq, near the Iraq-Saudi border. Some of those strikes took place in close proximity to the commencement of the nominal US-Iran ceasefire. Saudi Arabia, which absorbed 38 ballistic missiles and 435 kamikaze drones from Iran during the conflict, all intercepted, was not only a passive defensive actor using its Patriot and THAAD batteries, it was conducting offensive strikes against the Iranian proxy network in southern Iraq. This places Saudi Arabia alongside the UAE and the United States as confirmed offensive actors in the current conflict. 3 Gulf states are now active participants in the military dimension of the pressure being applied to Iran. The regional coalition against Iranian aggression is larger and more geographically distributed than the public framing of this as a US-Iran conflict has suggested. Every additional confirmed actor is an additional pressure vector that the IRGC's fractured command structure must account for. Now let us talk about what happened in Kuwait. The IRGC commando infiltration attempt and the subsequent gunfight is one of the most revealing single events about the IRGC's current operational thinking and its institutional desperation. Iran's foreign minister issued a public statement claiming that Kuwait unlawfully attacked an Iranian boat and detained 4 Iranian citizens, demanding immediate release. That statement is the diplomatic packaging for what actually happened. IRGC commandos attempted to infiltrate Kuwait. A confrontation began. 1 Kuwaiti soldier was wounded. The IRGC personnel were captured and are now being interrogated. The 4 detained individuals are not fishermen. They are IRGC commandos who are attempting an operation in Kuwait that the Kuwaiti security forces detected and interdicted. The IRGC is attempting commando infiltrations into Kuwait, a country increasingly aligned with the American coalition position. It no longer has a conventional navy capable of projecting force. Its underground missile cities were destroyed. Its shadow fleet gambit failed. Its mosquito fleet is hiding in coastal caves. What it has left is its intelligence and special operations capability, and it is deploying that capability against Kuwait in an operation that failed and was publicly exposed, which is the operational signature of an organization running out of options. Now let us get into the B-1 bomber training runs from England. Because the pattern of what these aircraft are doing and where they are doing it is the same pattern that appeared before both the Venezuela operation and the opening night of Operation Epic Fury, multiple B-1B Lancer bombers are conducting training missions from bases in England, tracking down through Europe on flight paths oriented toward the Middle East. These are not random training exercises. The B-1B is a supersonic strategic bomber with the largest conventional payload capacity in the American bomber inventory. It is the platform that carries the GBU-72, the 5,000-pound bunker buster, in numbers that make it the primary delivery system for Operation Sledgehammer's second tier of hardened targets. When B-1s are conducting training runs that track toward the Middle East, they are maintaining the crew proficiency and mission rehearsal currency that operational execution requires. Military operations of this complexity are not executed by crews who last practiced the specific mission profile weeks or months ago. They are executed by crews who have been running the specific flight profiles, the specific weapons delivery parameters, the specific electronic warfare environment navigation, at a frequency that keeps those proficiencies at the edge of operational readiness. The B-1 training runs from England are the signature of an operational timeline that is closer than the diplomatic track's nominal continuation would suggest to most outside observers. Before Venezuela, the pattern was B-52s and other strategic assets running training missions that tracked toward the target area in the weeks before the operation launched. Before Operation Epic Fury, similar patterns appeared. The B-1 training runs tracking through Europe toward the Middle East are the same pattern in the same stage of the same operational sequence that has preceded every major American military operation in the current administration's tenure. Now let us get into the full operational picture of what the missile reconstitution numbers mean for Operation Sledgehammer's targeting architecture. Because the New York Times assessment of 70% missile retention and 90% underground facility access recovery has just expanded Operation Sledgehammer's targeting list in ways that directly intersect with the Shiraz explosion's likely cause. 90% underground facility access recovery means that the facilities Operation Epic Fury did not target or could not reach with its initial strike package have been assessed as partially or fully operational. Some of those facilities are in Shiraz, some are in Fordo, some are in Isfahan. Some are distributed across the hardened underground infrastructure that Iran has spent decades building specifically to survive exactly the kind of air campaign Operation Epic Fury conducted. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator that the Air Force just contracted to restock at a cost exceeding $100 million is the weapon designed for exactly those facilities. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber that carries the GBU-57 is the platform that can penetrate the air defense coverage over those facilities without being detected until the weapon has already been released. The RC-135 rivet joint that has been conducting signals intelligence collection around the Iranian theatre is building the electronic order of battle that the B-2's crew needs to navigate the remaining Iranian air defense network without triggering an engagement that would compromise the stealth advantage the B-2's design requires to execute its mission. And the Shiraz explosion, whatever actually caused it, has provided CENTCOM with real-time intelligence about which underground facilities are operationally active, what kinds of activity those facilities are supporting, and where the highest value targets in the reconstituted underground network are currently located. Read what that intelligence collection produces for the targeting list. Every underground facility that Iran digs out during the ceasefire window is a facility that demonstrates its operational status through the activity required to dig it out. Satellite imagery captures that activity. SIGINT collection captures the communications around that activity. And occasionally, as the Shiraz explosion suggests, the activity itself produces an event that confirms the facility type and operational content with more certainty than surveillance imagery alone provides. The IRGC's reconstitution effort during the ceasefire is simultaneously rebuilding its military capability and refining the American targeting list for the next phase of the campaign. Every missile that gets dug out and moved to a mobile launcher is a missile that the E-2D Hawkeye, the RC-135 and the satellite constellation are tracking. Every underground facility that gets partially or fully restored to operational status during the ceasefire window is a facility that Operation Sledgehammer's GBU-57 and GBU-72 inventory has been sized and positioned to address. Now let us bring all three tracks together into the complete strategic picture of what May 14, 2026 represents. The financial track. 67 ships turned around. 4 shot up for non-compliance, $500 million per day compounding loss. 73 Iranian tankers motionless in the Gulf. The Karg Island oil slick growing. The Pakistani trade corridor, representing Iran's only remaining economic connection to global markets, controlled by the country that just declared Saudi Arabia a red line. The financial track is not producing Iranian capitulation on the administration's timeline. But it is producing the storage crisis, the well-shut-down threshold approach, and the proxy network dissolution that make Iran's endurance window progressively more optimistic as the daily damage compounds. The military track. Multiple B-1 bombers running training missions toward the Middle East from England. The GBU-57 restock contract awarded. Operation Sledgehammer naming under active Pentagon discussion. CENTCOM releasing footage of boarding operations and the clinical application of defensive munitions against vessels that refuse to comply. Saudi Arabia confirmed to have struck Iranian militia in southern Iraq. The UAE deploying anti-drone steel cage defences at oil storage sites, a defensive measure and a public acknowledgement that the drone threat from Iran's reconstituted swarm inventory is being actively planned against. The intelligence track. The Shiraz explosion pointing to active missile reconstitution activity in underground facilities. The New York Times assessment confirming 70% missile retention and 90% underground facility access. The IRGC commando infiltration attempt in Kuwait revealing the special operations desperation that follows the loss of conventional military options. Chinese vessels transiting the blockade during the summit, creating the weapon supply question the Trump agenda must now address. 8 unexplained white aircraft that entered Iranian airspace during the ceasefire, carrying payloads assessed as weapons or components from Russian or Chinese territory. Here is the honest assessment of where the situation stands on May 14, 2026. It requires placing the Trump-Beijing summit at the center of the analysis, rather than treating it as diplomatic background to the operational developments. The summit is the single remaining variable that can alter the timeline every other indicator in this analysis is pointing toward. Treasury Secretary Bessent confirmed that Iran is a centerpiece of the discussion. China hosted Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi in the days before the summit. China has told Araghchi that a deal needs to happen. Araghchi communicated back what the IRGC's command structure allows him to communicate. The civilian diplomatic faction understands a deal needs to happen, but cannot authorize one without IRGC permission. And the IRGC's institutional survival logic prohibits granting. China's ability to pressure Iran toward a deal depends on whether Beijing is willing to use the economic leverage it holds. Specifically, the threat of reducing Chinese oil purchases from Iran to accelerate the physics clock on Karg Island's storage crisis. If China walks out of this summit having committed to genuinely apply that leverage, the timeline for Iranian decision-making compresses dramatically. If China walks out having agreed to stop the weapon supply flow and halt Chinese vessel transits through the blockade zone, the reconstitution effort is slowed or stopped at its most critical phase. And if China does neither of those things, then the B-1s, the GBU-57 restock, the Operation Sledgehammer discussion, and the expanding targeting list all point to an operational timeline that the summit's conclusion will initiate rather than prevent. The Kuwait commando infiltration attempt is the structural risk that sits underneath the diplomatic optimism surrounding the Beijing summit. The IRGC command structure that authorized commandos to attempt infiltration into Kuwait during a period of active diplomacy is not a command structure that is coordinating its operational decisions with the civilian diplomatic faction conducting those negotiations. Arachi is in diplomatic meetings. IRGC commanders are sending commandos into Kuwait. The same decentralized command architecture that produced the May 7th denial of sea doctrine execution, the same fractured institutional structure where regional unit commanders operate with autonomy that the central command cannot reliably supervise or revoke. That is not a government negotiating in good faith. That is an organization conducting covert operations under diplomatic cover, betting that the diplomatic track's continuance provides operational protection for activities that would be classified as acts of war if conducted openly. And the 4 IRGC commandos being held in Kuwaiti custody right now are being interrogated about the operational planning that authorized the mission, the command structure that directed it, and the targets and timeline that the mission was part of. That intelligence extracted from the commandos whose operation failed and whose operational knowledge is now in the hands of a country aligned with the coalition enforcing the blockade, is the most consequential intelligence windfall of the ceasefire period, and it was delivered by an operation that the IRGC authorized during active diplomacy. Now let us talk about the UAE's anti-drone steel cage deployment, because this development tells you something specific about what the UAE's military planners believe the next phase of Iranian drone operations will look like, and on what timeline they believe it will occur. The UAE has begun deploying anti-drone defense systems at oil storage sites with capabilities specifically designed against heavy UAVs, installing steel cage structures above oil facilities to absorb and stop drone strikes before they reach the storage infrastructure below. This is not a routine defensive upgrade. Steel cage installation over oil storage sites during a ceasefire is an emergency defensive measure executed on a compressed timeline by a military that has assessed that the drone threat against those facilities is operationally imminent rather than theoretically possible. The UAE was confirmed as the third combatant in this war through its Mirage strike on the Lavon refinery. It absorbed 55 total confirmed Iranian ballistic missiles, cruise missiles and drone attacks during the conflict, and it is now installing physical defensive structures over its most economically critical infrastructure during the ceasefire window. That installation pattern is the defensive equivalent of the B-1 training runs. The UAE is preparing for the next phase at exactly the same speed and urgency that the American bomber crews are maintaining through their England-based training missions toward the Middle East. The global picture that all of these data points assemble is one of a conflict that is in a nominal ceasefire that neither side is treating as a genuine cessation. Iran is digging out its missiles. China is supplying weapons components. 8 white aircraft entered Iranian airspace with unknown payloads. Iranian commandos attempted a covert infiltration into Kuwait. The IRGC's Rear Admiral expanded the operational Hormuz zone by 10 times. 67 ships have been turned around and 4 have been shot up. The B-1s are flying training runs from England. Pakistan has drawn a red line around Saudi Arabia, with 13,000 troops and a nuclear arsenal. Saudi Arabia has confirmed strikes on Iraqi militias. The UAE has confirmed the Lavon refinery strike and is installing steel cages over its oil infrastructure. And in Beijing, the President of the United States is sitting across from the Chinese President in a 36-hour summit where Iran is a centerpiece agenda item. Chinese vessels are transiting the Hormuz blockade during the diplomatic window. The question of whether China will stop supplying Iran with weapons is the most consequential single decision that Beijing will make in the next 36 hours for the trajectory of the next 30 days. The answer China gives will determine when the B-1s transition from training runs to operational sorties. If Beijing commits to halting weapon supply and pressuring Tehran toward nuclear concessions, the physics clock on Karg Island remains the binding constraint, and the 3 to 4 month CIA endurance window drives the timeline. If Beijing declines, then Iran's reconstitution of underground facility access becomes the operational condition. Operation Sledgehammer's targeting list includes the Shiraz facilities, where something exploded on May 13th, the Fordow enrichment site, the Natanz processing infrastructure, and every other underground installation that the New York Times assessment and the IRGC's own reconstitution activity have placed back on the operationally significant list. The B-1s are running toward the Middle East from England. The question is whether they turn around before the summit concludes, or whether they keep going after it.